June 12, 1944. The hedgerows of Normandy, France. In a muddy communications trench 3 kilometers inland from Utah Beach, Private First Class Charles Chibity of the 4th Infantry Division pressed a field telephone receiver against his ear, listening to the crackling voice of his commanding officer. Around him, the humid air carried the smell of churned earth and diesel fuel from the supply trucks rumbling past. He believed this would be another routine day of relaying coordinates and troop movements, just as he had done for the past 6 days since the landing. The German armed forces of that era, he assumed, would intercept their radio transmissions just as they always did, decode them within hours, and adjust their defensive positions accordingly. What Private Chibity could not have known was that within the next 7 days, his voice speaking in his native Comanche language would create such confusion among 3 entire German divisions that their intelligence officers would file reports claiming the American forces had deployed a completely unknown encryption system more sophisticated than anything the Allied powers had previously used. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. This is the account of how one Native American signalman, armed with nothing more than a language spoken by fewer than 3,000 people on Earth, accidentally convinced the German military leadership that they were facing an unbreakable cipher machine, when in reality he was simply talking to his fellow Comanche soldiers in the words his grandmother had taught him as a child. Charles Chibity was 21 years old that summer, a slender man with dark eyes and calloused hands from years of working on his family's ranch in Oklahoma. He had enlisted in 1942, following his older brother into service, and had been assigned to communications after his superiors discovered he could transmit messages with remarkable speed and accuracy. What they did not initially realize was that Charles was one of 17 Comanche men who had been quietly recruited into a specialized program, training them to use their native language as a code system. Unlike the more famous Navajo code talkers serving in the Pacific Theater, the Comanche program was smaller, less documented, and in many ways more improvised. The men had developed their own military vocabulary, creating Comanche words for tanks, turtles, aircraft, birds with metal feathers, and various tactical terms that had no equivalent in their traditional language. On that particular morning, Charles had been ordered to establish communication between the regimental command post and forward observation units pushing through the dense bocage countryside. The hedgerows, ancient earthen walls covered with thick vegetation, created natural fortifications that turned every field into a potential battlefield. Radio communication was essential, but also dangerous. German signal intelligence units, the Funkaufklärung, were known to be highly sophisticated, operating mobile listening posts that could intercept Allied transmissions, triangulate positions, and in some cases decode messages within hours using frequency analysis and pattern recognition techniques they had refined during years of conflict. The American military command had grown increasingly concerned about the vulnerability of their communications. Standard encryption methods, while effective against casual interception, could be broken given enough time and resources. Codebooks could be captured, cipher machines could malfunction, human error could compromise entire networks. The Comanche program represented a different approach entirely, using a living language as the encryption key itself, a language so rare and complex that virtually no one outside the Comanche community could understand it. Charles adjusted his headset and began transmitting the day's first messages. His voice, speaking in rapid Comanche, reported grid coordinates, supply requirements, and troop movements. To any German listening post, it would have sounded completely alien, not like any European language, not like any encryption pattern they had encountered, not like any code system in their extensive reference files. The phonemes, the tonal qualities, the grammatical structure, everything about it defied their analytical frameworks. 3 kilometers to the east, in a camouflaged listening post, hidden in the ruins of a stone farmhouse, Feldwebel Hans Richter of the German Signal Intelligence Unit sat with his headphones clamped over his ears, slowly adjusting the frequency dial on his radio receiver. He was 34 years old, a former linguistics professor from Munich, who had been drafted into military service and assigned to communications intelligence because of his fluency in English, French, and Russian. For the past week, he had been intercepting American radio traffic, transcribing transmissions, and forwarding them to the division's cryptanalysis section for decoding. Most of it was straightforward, encrypted with systems the German intelligence services had already partially compromised. But starting on June 7th, the day after the initial landing, Richter had begun hearing something different. A voice, speaking in short, rapid bursts of what sounded like complete gibberish. Not encrypted English, not a cipher, something else entirely. Richter had initially assumed it was interference, atmospheric distortion corrupting the signal. But the pattern was too consistent, too purposeful. It had the rhythm of communication, questions and responses, pauses that suggested someone writing down information, the formal structure of military reporting, yet none of it made any linguistic sense. He transcribed what he heard phonetically, filling page after page with strange syllables that followed no pattern he recognized. When he forwarded the transcriptions to the Division Intelligence Office, the response had been skeptical. Probably just atmospheric noise, they said. Focus on the real traffic. But Richter could not shake the conviction that he was hearing actual communication. On June 10th, he had intercepted a particularly long transmission in this unknown language, following it for nearly 20 minutes as it seemed to coordinate some kind of movement. That same evening, American forces launched a coordinated assault on 3 German positions along a 5-kilometer front, exactly the kind of operation that would require extensive radio coordination beforehand. The correlation was too perfect to be coincidence. By June 12, Richter had convinced his commanding officer to take the matter seriously. A report was filed to higher headquarters, describing an unidentified encryption system of extreme sophistication, being used by American forces for tactical communication. The report noted that the system appeared to use verbal transmission rather than ciphertext, suggesting a possible voice encryption technology that the intelligence division had not previously encountered. The phonetic transcriptions were attached, with a request for immediate cryptanalysis support. What no one in the German intelligence apparatus realized was that they were not facing a cipher at all. They were hearing a language that had been spoken on the plains of Oklahoma and Texas for centuries, a language that had no written form until the late 19th century, a language that shared no linguistic roots with any European or Asian language family in their reference materials. To their trained ears, accustomed to breaking codes through frequency analysis, pattern recognition, and mathematical decryption, the Comanche language was utterly impenetrable because it was not a code. It was simply a different way of organizing human thought into sound. Charles Chibity, unaware that his transmissions were causing such confusion, continued his work. He spoke with Corporal Forrest Cassenavoid, another Comanche soldier positioned with a forward artillery unit coordinating fire support for advancing infantry. He relayed messages from Private First Class Willie Yakeshi, who was attached to a reconnaissance patrol probing German defensive lines. The 3 men, along with their fellow Comanche Signalman scattered throughout the 4th Infantry Division, created an impromptu communication network that was secure not because of technological sophistication, but because of cultural specificity. The genius of the system lay not just in the language itself, but in how the Comanche soldiers had adapted it for military use. When Charles needed to report that a tank had been spotted, he said, "Wakarishi," the word for turtle. When describing an artillery position, he used Numu Tekwa Ru, literally our people's iron coming. For compass directions, they used the traditional Comanche terms based on the sun's movement, Tabi toward the sun for east, Tabibaki as away from the sun for west. These were not random code words that could be deciphered through pattern analysis. They were organic extensions of how the Comanche people had always described the world around them. By June 14, the German intelligence division had escalated the matter to Corps headquarters. 3 different cryptanalysis teams, including specialists who had successfully broken British codes earlier in the conflict, had examined the transcriptions and found them completely baffling. One analyst, a mathematician from Berlin, wrote in his assessment that the system appeared to use a non-repeating random key system with spoken implementation, which he considered theoretically impossible given the constraints of human speech. Another analyst suggested it might be a highly sophisticated version of the American military's Signalman cipher machine, somehow adapted for voice transmission. A third theorist proposed that the Americans had recruited linguists who had created an entirely artificial language designed specifically to resist cryptanalysis. All three were wrong, but their conclusions had real consequences. German commanders, believing they were facing an unbreakable encryption system, began assuming that all American radio traffic was secure. This led to a strategic miscalculation. They redirected their signal intelligence resources toward trying to crack this super cipher, pulling analysts away from the more routine encrypted transmissions that they could actually decode. Meanwhile, the German forces in Normandy, unable to gain intelligence from intercepted communications, became more cautious in their defensive planning, less able to anticipate American movements, more reactive rather than proactive. The confusion reached its peak on June 16, when Charles Chibity coordinated a complex three-pronged advance involving infantry, armor, and artillery across a 12-kilometer front. For 3 hours he transmitted a steady stream of Comanche messages, coordinating timing, adjusting fire support, relaying intelligence about German positions. German listening posts intercepted every word, transcribed every syllable, and forwarded it all to intelligence headquarters, where analysts stared at the pages with growing frustration. The phonetic patterns defied every cryptanalytic technique in their arsenal. There were no repeating phrases that might indicate code words, no mathematical patterns that might suggest algorithmic encryption, no linguistic structures that matched any known language family. One German intelligence officer, in a moment of dark humor, wrote in his daily log that the Americans must have recruited a team of Martians to handle their radio communications, because no human language on Earth could sound so completely alien. He was closer to the truth than he realized. The Comanche language, with its complex verb structures, its incorporation of evidentiality markers that specified how the speaker knew information, its use of pitch accent to distinguish meaning, and its system of grammatical cases that worked completely differently from Indo-European languages, was indeed alien to European linguistic traditions. But it was not from Mars. It was from Oklahoma. The full extent of the confusion became apparent when a captured German intelligence report later revealed that 3 different divisions, the 243rd Infantry Division, the 77th Infantry Division, and the 2nd Parachute Division, had all filed reports about the mysterious encryption system. Each division had intercepted what they believed were encrypted communications in their sector, not realizing they were all hearing the same thing: Comanche soldiers doing their jobs. The German High Command, receiving multiple reports about this unknown cipher system from different units, concluded that the American forces must have deployed it across their entire front, indicating a major new security protocol. This assessment further elevated the perceived importance of cracking the code, drawing even more analytical resources into a futile effort. Charles Chibity learned none of this at the time. For him, those 7 days in mid-June were simply a continuation of his duties, transmitting messages, coordinating operations, doing his part to support the soldiers, pushing through the Norman hedgerows. He did notice that German artillery seemed less accurate than expected, that their counterattacks seemed poorly timed, that they appeared to be struggling with coordination. But he attributed this to American tactical superiority, not realizing that his voice, speaking the language of his ancestors, was directly contributing to German confusion. On June 17, the intensity of the fighting decreased as both sides paused to consolidate positions. Charles was rotated back to the division command post for a brief rest. As he sat in a supply tent, eating cold rations and writing a letter to his family back in Oklahoma, he had a conversation with Lieutenant Robert Patterson, one of the signals officers who had advocated for the Comanche program. Patterson had just received an intelligence briefing that included information from a captured German signals manual. Patterson said to Charles, his voice filled with barely suppressed amusement, "Do you know what the German intelligence analysts are calling your transmissions? They think you're using some kind of advanced machine cipher. They've been trying to crack it for over a week." Charles looked up from his letter, confused. Machine cipher? I'm just speaking Comanche. I know, Patterson replied, and that's exactly why they can't figure it out. They're looking for mathematical patterns, frequency analysis, all their sophisticated cryptography techniques. But you can't use frequency analysis on a language they've never heard before. Every code-breaking method they have assumes the underlying message is in a language they know, English, French, Russian. They're trying to decrypt something that isn't encrypted. The realization struck Charles with an odd mixture of pride and bemusement. His language, the one that government boarding schools had tried to erase from Native American children for decades, the one that had been called primitive and savage by those who knew nothing about its complexity, that language was now confounding some of the most sophisticated military intelligence analysts in the world. The very thing that had made his people targets of cultural suppression was now proving to be an invaluable military asset. This irony was not lost on Charles or his fellow Comanche soldiers. Many of them had attended boarding schools where speaking their native language was prohibited, where they had been punished for using the words their grandparents had taught them. Now the American military was not only permitting them to speak Comanche, it was depending on it. The language that had been treated as a problem to be solved was now solving problems for the military. The tactical impact of this linguistic confusion extended beyond just the 7-day period of maximum befuddlement. Throughout the remainder of June and into July, as American forces pushed deeper into France, the Comanche code talkers continued their work. The German intelligence apparatus, having invested significant resources into trying to crack what they believed was an unbreakable cipher, remained focused on the wrong problem. They collected thousands of pages of phonetic transcriptions, subjected them to every analytical method available, consulted with linguists and mathematicians, and got nowhere. Meanwhile, more conventional encrypted American communications, which the German analysts could have partially decoded, received less attention because they seemed less important compared to this mysterious supercipher. The psychological impact on German intelligence officers was significant. Several post-conflict interviews with German signals personnel revealed that the existence of an apparently unbreakable American encryption system contributed to a sense of technological inferiority. They had believed their own signal intelligence capabilities were superior to the Allied forces, based on their successes earlier in the conflict. The sudden appearance of a communication system they could not even begin to crack shook that confidence. It suggested that American technological capabilities were more advanced than German intelligence had estimated, which contributed to broader concerns about America's industrial and scientific capacity. What made the situation even more remarkable was its accidental nature. The Comanche Code Talker program had not been designed to psychologically defeat German cryptanalysts. It had been implemented primarily as a practical security measure, a way to ensure that tactical communications could not be easily intercepted and understood. The fact that it created such extensive confusion was an unintended but welcome bonus. Unlike the elaborate deception operations that characterized much of the conflict, this was not a carefully planned ruse. It was simply the natural consequence of using a linguistic resource that the opposing forces had no framework for understanding. Charles Chibity continued his service throughout the Normandy campaign and into the push across France. He participated in communications operations during the liberation of Paris, the advance to the German border, and finally into Germany itself in the spring of 1945. Throughout this period, he and his fellow Comanche soldiers maintained their linguistic security role, though the German signal intelligence apparatus gradually became less effective as the military situation deteriorated. By early 1945, German forces were so fragmented and under-resourced that sophisticated signals intelligence became almost impossible regardless of encryption methods. After the conflict ended in May 1945, Charles returned to Oklahoma. He worked various jobs, started a family, and lived a quiet life. For decades, the Comanche Code Talker program remained relatively unknown, overshadowed by the larger and better documented Navajo Code Talker program in the Pacific. It was not until the late 1980s and early 1990s that historians began to fully document the contributions of the Comanche soldiers and other Native American code talkers who had served in the European theater. In 1989, Charles Chibity and his fellow Comanche code talkers were finally recognized by the French government, which awarded them the Chevalier de l'Ordre National du Mérite, the Knight of the National Order of Merit, for their contributions to the liberation of France. Charles, then an elderly man, traveled to France for the ceremony. In interviews given during that trip, he reflected on the strange twist of fate that had made his native language, a language his teachers had once tried to forbid him from speaking, into a military weapon. Charles said in one interview, his voice carrying the weight of years, "When I was young, they told me my language was worthless, that it had no place in the modern world. They wanted us to forget it, to become like everyone else. But that language, the one they wanted to erase, that language helped win the conflict. It protected American soldiers, it confused the enemy, and nobody could take it away from us, no matter how hard they tried, because it was part of who we were." The story of those 7 days in June 1944, when Charles Chibity's transmissions confused 3 German divisions, represents a microcosm of a larger historical irony. The United States government, which had spent decades attempting to suppress Native American languages through forced assimilation policies and boarding school systems designed to erase indigenous cultures, found itself dependent on those very languages for military security. The linguistic diversity that had been treated as a problem became a strategic asset. The cultural knowledge that had been dismissed as primitive became sophisticated beyond the understanding of European cryptographers. For the German intelligence officers who spent those days in June trying to crack the Comanche code, the experience must have been deeply frustrating. They were trained professionals, equipped with advanced analytical tools and backed by years of cryptographic experience. Yet they were defeated not by superior technology or mathematical genius, but by simple linguistic diversity, by the existence of a language that fell outside their frame of reference. They were looking for a cipher where none existed, searching for patterns in data that was not encoded, but merely foreign. Their sophistication became their weakness because they could not conceive of a security system that did not rely on mathematical complexity. The captured intelligence reports that surfaced after the conflict revealed the extent of this cognitive blind spot. One German analysis, dated June 20, 1944, described the Comanche transmissions as possibly the most sophisticated encryption system encountered in the current conflict, and recommended that highest priority be given to recruiting linguists and cryptographers capable of approaching this problem from unconventional angles. Another report from a different division suggested that the Americans might have developed an early form of computer-assisted encryption decades before such technology actually existed. A third document proposed that the strange sounds might be not language at all, but rather a form of frequency shift keying disguised as speech, a theory that led analysts down yet another analytical dead end. These documents, preserved in military archives, stand as testament to how completely the German intelligence apparatus misunderstood what they were hearing. Every theory they generated, no matter how creative, started from the assumption that they were dealing with encrypted English or some other known language. The possibility that it might simply be a completely different language, one that bore no relationship to any linguistic family in their reference materials, seems to have occurred to very few analysts, and even when that possibility was considered, they lacked the linguistic resources to identify it. The German military had linguists familiar with dozens of languages, but none who had any knowledge of Comanche or the broader Uto-Aztecan language family to which it belonged. This linguistic blind spot was not unique to the German forces. Similar confusion would have affected any military force of that era that did not have specific knowledge of Native American languages. The genius of the Code Talker programs, both Comanche and Navajo, lay in exploiting the basic fact that most of the world's population had never heard these languages and had no framework for understanding their structure. They were secure, not because they were complex, but because they were unknown. Charles Chibity passed away in 2005 at the age of 83. In his later years, he had become an advocate for preserving the Comanche language, teaching it to younger generations, and working with linguistic researchers to document its structure and vocabulary. He understood that the language that had served him so well during the conflict was endangered, spoken fluently by fewer and fewer people with each passing year. The irony that this language, once considered so valuable for military purposes, was now struggling to survive was not lost on him. In one of his last public appearances at a veterans gathering in Oklahoma in 2004, Charles spoke about the meaning of his service. He said, his voice still clear despite his age, "We did not go to fight for America because America had been perfect to us. We went because we are Comanche, and the Comanche have always been warriors. We fought for our families, for our communities, for the idea that maybe after the conflict things would be better. And we fought using the one thing that made us different, our language. That language was a gift from our ancestors, and for a few years it became the gift we gave to our country." The legacy of the Comanche code talkers and Charles Chibiti's confounding of German intelligence in June 1944 extends beyond military history. It represents a profound statement about the value of linguistic and cultural diversity. In a world that often pressures minority cultures to assimilate, to abandon their languages and traditions in favor of dominant norms, the code talker story demonstrates that difference itself can be a strength. The very thing that made the Comanche language seem other to mainstream American culture, its radical difference from English, its unique phonological and grammatical structures, was exactly what made it valuable for secure communication. This lesson remains relevant decades later. As languages continue to disappear around the world at an accelerating rate, we lose not just words, but entire ways of thinking, unique perspectives on human experience, and potentially valuable knowledge systems. The fact that a language spoken by a small community in Oklahoma could prove crucial to military operations in France reminds us that we cannot always predict where value will be found. What seems marginal or unimportant in peacetime may become essential in crisis. What appears to be merely cultural heritage may turn out to have practical applications we never anticipated. The 7 days in June 1944, when Private First Class Charles Chibiti's Comanche transmissions created chaos among German intelligence analysts, thus become more than just an interesting anecdote from military history. They become a parable about the dangers of monoculture, the value of diversity, and the unexpected ways that marginalized knowledge can become central to solving problems. The German analysts, for all their sophistication and training, were defeated by their own assumptions, the assumption that all meaningful communication would happen in languages they knew, using encryption systems based on mathematical principles they understood. They could not imagine that security might come not from complexity, but from difference, not from technological advancement, but from cultural preservation. For Charles Chibiti, sitting in that muddy trench in Normandy, speaking words his grandmother had taught him, the deeper significance of what he was doing would only become clear with time. In that moment, he was simply a soldier doing his duty, using the tools available to him. That one of those tools was a language thousands of years old, carried across centuries and continents, preserved through generations despite active efforts to erase it, and now deployed against one of the most powerful military forces in the world. That was the kind of irony that only history could write. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.